Good afternoon. My name is Anthony Fields, and I would like to present to you today my topic on compulsive internet usage with respect to response inhibition and its impact on academic performance. I would like to introduce my thesis committee members, Dr. Milton Faison, Dr. Isis Walton, and Dr. Sherman Ward. The number of internet users has increased over the past few decades. Now, are the increased number of internet users a problem? It is when users can no longer control their impulse to use the internet. We refer to this as compulsive internet usage or internet addiction disorder. Compulsive internet disorder is defined as an individual's inability to control their impulse to utilize the internet to the point that it affects daily mental and social behaviors. Compulsive internet usage or internet addiction disorder was derived from the DSM-4 criteria associated with pathological gambling. And individuals who fell under 8 symptoms are classified as internet addicts. The symptoms include preoccupation with the internet, a need for longer periods of time on the internet, repeated attempts to reduce internet use, withdrawal symptoms when reducing internet use, time management issues, environmental distress with family, school, work, and friends, deception around time spent online, and mood modifications through the internet. So why are these people addicted in the first place? Well, this is due to one of our components of executive function. Executive function is a set of general purpose control mechanisms linked to the prefrontal cortex of the brain that regulates human cognition and actions. Our executive functions are key components of self-control and self-regulation ability and has shown to have a broad implication on everyday life. Components of executive function include updating, shift, dual task, and response inhibition, which I will be talking to you today about. So response inhibition. We define response inhibition as the ability to override the prepotent decision. Here we find that you can also measure impulsiveness, and impulsiveness is categorized under a various few traits. We can measure those traits under the Barrett Impulse Scale that tests for attention, motor skills, self-control, cognitive complexity, perseverance, and cognitive instability. In doing so, persons who usually score high on impulsiveness tend to become addicts. So what is impulsivity? Impulsivity is action without thought and involves premature responses, poor impulse control, and a low tolerance for delay. Individuals who have shown to have poor impulse control are pathological gamblers and substance abuse addicts. Example of poor impulse control are pathological gamblers who continue to gamble even though they have a lot of financial debt. So how do you test for impulse control? You can test what is called impulse control by using the go no go test, which is which is a method that measures response time after the stimulus onset and through the reaction time to inhibit a response. And delays in this time or failure to inhibit the response signifies impulsive decision making. The framework for the go-no-go test consists of two stimuli: a go stimuli requiring a response, typically the push of a button, what we used in our case, and no-go stimuli, which we categorize as a red block. So when individuals saw two blocks, one was green, one was red, this was the no-go stimuli. And they were required to inhibit the response, meaning they do not press a button at all. And the go stimuli was when they seen a green box and a white box. And in order to simulate impulsive response, there must be more go trials than no-go trials. Another test we looked at was the EEG, which actually allows us to look at the neural activity that's going on during response inhibition. And this allows you to see which actual, which neural substrates are being activated and which circuitries are generating the signals, and the actual latencies that is taken for once the brain to make contact with the stimuli, and how long it takes to travel to another depth of the brain where processing occurs. So here we want to look at the EEG looks at neural substrates through event-related potentials, ERPs. The ERPs that we looked at were the N200 and the P300, that are, again, which are components that show signals generated from the neural substrates to process specific behaviors or psychological states. The neural substrates involved in impulsivity and addiction. The neural substrates function from a top-down subcortical structures. The nucleus accumbens, which is also the nucleus that's involved in addiction. The frontal regions of the brain, the orbital frontal cortex, and the anterior cingulate and the dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex, which are implicated in the go-no-go test. The anterior cingulate actually plays a key role in response inhibition by orchestrating the signals to be sent to the prefrontal cortex to activate our conflict monitoring processes. And you can see those through the N2 ERP to recognize the presence of a stimuli and respond accordingly. So in addiction, again, the regions involved, everything goes from the prefrontal cortex and goes through executive function. Executive function, the components are the key determinants for exactly, are we able to inhibit this response, or are we going to let the stimulus drive us? An example of this primarily is someone who's trying to go on a diet and they know they shouldn't have a lot of high caloric foods. And when they see these foods, they still cannot stop eating them, even though they're on a diet. This is an example of poor impulse control, and the cravings that we occur when we have this addiction. We want to have certain things that drive us or makes us feel good, our reward system. And there is a whole network of circuitry that focuses upon that. And our prefrontal cortex monitors this and allows us to send signals to be transmitted throughout the brain to allows us to respond accordingly. And the anterior cingulate is what sends the signal back to the prefrontal cortex. And it's more of like a feedback system where signals are constantly being going over the network, and that's how signals are being transferred. A little bit about the N200. We see when we look at the N200 in the EEG, it's a negative deflection peak at about 200 to 300 milliseconds after the stimuli has been presented. And it's also referred to as the mismatch negative because it's been shown to identify stimuli, attentional shifts, inhibition of motor functions, conflict monitoring, response selection timing, and recognition of novel stimuli. The other ERP, the P300, was something that's been widely studied for over a long period of time. Typically, the brain reaches full maturity at age 25. So we normally characterize as seeing the P300 at about 300 to 450 milliseconds after the stimuli has been presented. Latencies are interpreted based upon the speed of the stimuli, and they're classified as how we discriminate what is the appropriate response. So the P300 is where we actually decide what the response should be. We evaluate this period, and the shorter latencies that we see to get to this, once we get to this stage, or I'm sorry, after we get past this stage, signifies superior mental performance relative to the longer latencies where it takes your mind longer to process. And that's what this is what we see in addicts, a higher, longer latencies and higher amplitudes. The P300 is actually composed of two subunits as well. The P3A is responsible for attentional orientation, and the P3B, which aids in indexing memory. And any reduction that we see in the P3 peaks are something that you'll usually see in some type of substance abuse, substance dependency, risky behavior practices, or adult antisocial behaviors. So why do you see a sudden increase in addiction research? Majority of the increase in internet users are between the ages of 14 to 21. And the comorbidities associated with internet addiction can lead to academic performance issues. We define academic performance as the outcome of education by which students, teachers, or institutions have achieved their educational goal. But we also use a standard measure for academic performance as the GPA. As we know, during the early stages of development, children tend to become very impulsive. They're very inattentive, especially during our developmental stage. It's hard to get children to focus and pay attention. But these are key components that must be regulated as we go on, because if they're not, they become problems for us as we continue to develop. And students who struggle with impulse control are at risk for developing short attention spans and become more hyperactive, which can also lead to poor academic performance. So my research aims were to investigate whether problematic internet use affects response inhibition and would it correlate to poor academic performance. My hypothesis one, students with high compulsive internet use will exhibit poor response inhibition and will correlate with poor academic performance. My second hypothesis was students with decreased response inhibition will correlate with poor academic performance. And my third hypothesis was students with high compulsive internet usage will exhibit lower N2 amplitudes and higher P3 amplitudes. Our methodology, we gathered 83 students who were recruited through the introductory biology classes from Virginia State University, and students' age ranges were between 17 and 36 years of age with an average age of 21. Data was collected through the Qualtrics online survey, and academic performance was all self-reported. And we used the compulsive internet use scale measured by Mykirk in 2009, developed by Mykirk in 2009. Now into the results. For relationship purposes, each variable was viewed inversely as well, and groups were compared high versus low overall by gender and within gender. So what we did first was we investigated college GPA versus compulsive internet use. And what we saw was students with high or low GPA did not differ in the compulsive internet use, did not exhibit compulsive internet use. Then we looked at it, obviously, we looked at the compulsive internet use, and we seen were there any relationship between that and GPAs, and we also didn't see any correlation was observed from our data. Then we want to focus more on the actual the go no go test, and we want to look at the percent of no go errors that that highlights impulsivity. So we saw that high compulsive internet use did not correlate with poor impulse control. But interestingly, when we switched it around, we saw that males who had higher error percentage in the no-go trials exhibited compulsive internet usage. Then we want to look at the percent of the no-go or of the go errors. The go errors mainly highlight inattentiveness, so they don't highlight an impulsivity, but attentional capacity. So we saw here that with respect to compulsive internet use, there was no relationship with inattentiveness by the groups. But inversely, we saw that actually males with lower go errors were more likely to be compulsive internet users in comparison to females with low go errors. So this can be interpreted as men have a shorter attention span than women. Next, we want to also look at reaction times. We looked at the reaction times for the goals first to try to understand if there were any difference there. We didn't see any differences observed amongst the reaction times for each group. But when we switched it around, we saw that the males with the faster reaction time exhibited compulsive internet use in comparison to the females with the faster reaction time. Now we want to get back into the impulsive decision making. So we looked at the reaction time for the no-goes. And what we found here, there was no correlation observed amongst the groups for the reaction time for the no-go trials. But inversely, we see that the males with the faster reaction times had compulsive internet use when compared to the females with the faster reaction speeds. So since we kind of have we looked at and tried to investigate the relationship between compulsive internet use and response inhibition, we understand already from previous literature, it says that poor response inhibition leads to addictive personalities or addictions in general. So we want to see how response inhibition had in a relationship with academic performance. So we looked at the percent no-goes. I'm sorry, we looked at the GPAs by percent no-goes, and we didn't see a relationship with any type of impulsive decision-making there. But interestingly, we found that the females who displayed greater impulse control had higher GPAs than compared to the females with decreased response inhibition. So we want to look at the actual percent goals for attentiveness and by GPA, and we found what females with higher GPAs showed greater attentiveness than females with lower GPAs. But by percent goals, we saw it had there was no observed relationship by GPA. I next want to present to you the EEG, my EEG graphs. The EEG graphs show midline region brain channels located frontal, central, and parietal in that order. So what we see here is the FZ no-go. That is the frontal region of the brain, where we see that in the high compulsive internet users, they have a greater peak than the low compulsive internet users. And then we switch over to the P3 amplitudes, and we see that the higher compulsive internet users do have a greater amplitude, but no correlation was observed. So then we looked at the central region of the brain, and even in this area as well, similar pattern going on. High compulsive internet users had a greater N2 peak, but and you also see a higher P3 amplitude, but there was no correlation observed here as well. And finally, in the parietal region of the brain, towards the back of the brain, we saw that based on groups, there was also no differences observed in these regions between the high and low groups as well. So even though there were mainly a fluctuation and N2 and the P3s, compulsive internet users did not have a lower N2 amplitude, but they did have a greater P3 amplitude, suggesting compulsive internet users may have a difficult time processing the appropriate response, but the data was not significant and suggests evidence of future evaluations. So based on my results, we came to the conclusion that males with high no-go errors and faster reaction times have decreased response inhibition, which correlates with high compulsive internet usage. And females with decreased impulse control show poor academic performance. And finally, females with good academic performance have better impulse control and greater attentional capacity. Thank you, and that will conclude my presentation.